Fact file on Zwingli. Name Huldrych Zwingli, aka Ulrich Zwingli. Nationality Swiss. Dates 1484 to 1531. Appearance: contemporary portrait shows him as pale and with only one eye. Oh, hang on, it's just a side-on profile. That's him there, roughly speaking. Before he was famous, he was a pastor, famous for being Lutheran and then falling out with Luther. Emphasised a plain, stripped-down church worship. Why does he matter? He believed that the Eucharist was purely symbolic. Nothing happened to the bread and wine in a physical sense, apart from being swallowed, which is pretty physical. Could you have a drink with him down the pub? Tricky, because he cut back their numbers and their opening hours and ordered publicans to report any instances of blasphemy. Probably safer to share a Toblerone. From bad to Würst. Challenges to the ecclesiastical authorities came in many forms. In Zurich, they came in the form of a sausage. On the 12th of March, 1522, a printer ate some sausage and egg on Ash Wednesday. This was Lent, and he had broken the fast. When the city council investigated, he told them that he was hungry. And anyway, Ulrich Zwingli said it was okay. Zwingli was a preacher in the city. He had been present at what has come to be called Sausage Gate. It's only called that by me. He had been, and he sprang to the printer's defence. Zwingli claimed the only law over Christians was the Bible. There was nothing in there about Lent. A debate was called, at which Zwingli argued that God does not desire our decrees or doctrines if they do not originate with him. The council agreed. Zwingli was free to preach, and Zurich went Protestant. Zwingli was a disciple of Luther, but like many of Luther's children, he was more radical than his spiritual dad. Under Zwingli's influence, Zurich stripped the churches of images. Ministers in plain clothing served communion from a table in the midst of the congregation. Monasteries were closed, and their buildings used for teaching or to house and care for the poor. In a move to delight music lovers everywhere, the Münster organ was bricked up. While Martin Luther supported the use of the organ, Calvin and Zwingli outlawed it. So they weren't all bad. Zwingli was a hardliner. Luther kept robes and some rituals. Zwingli saw them as the work of the Antichrist. But the issue that really divided them was the Eucharist. Luther believed a kind of watered-down version of transubstantiation. He talked about the ubiquity of Jesus Christ. Christ could be at the right hand of the Father and somehow at the same time in bread and wine. Zwingli was having none of that. The Eucharist was a reminder of the death of Christ. It was a spiritual act, but not a piece of magical trickery. Bread was bread and wine was wine, and sausage was sausage, and that was that. In time, though, people in Zurich began to out-Zwingli. A scholar called Conrad Grebel looked at the Bible and failed to find any infant baptism there. Instead, he found the words, "believe and be baptized." If, as Zwingli argued, sacraments had no mystical powers in and of themselves, but were merely expressions of faith, then baptism had to be the same. It was for believers. This was too much even for Zwingli. Infant baptism was about inclusion, about making sure that everyone entered the church, part of the fabric that bound society together. Grebel's ideas would essentially turn Christianity into a voluntary organisation. Grebel followed through with his ideas and refused to have his children baptized. In January 1525, the council gave Grebel and his followers an ultimatum. They had 8 days to get their children baptized, or else be expelled from the city. So, on the 21st of January, Grebel held a baptism. Not of children, but of adults, who repudiated their baptism as infants on the grounds that they could not possibly have been believers as a baby. They stated that theirs was the first true baptism in the church for 1,000 years. This group of dissenters went on to refuse to work for the state. They were pacifists. They were expelled from the city, and they became known as rebaptizers, or in mock Greek, the Anabaptists. And they were bitterly persecuted by the other Protestants. They were harried and chased and exiled. They became a kind of Protestant underground. Most Anabaptists tried to live quiet, inoffensive lives, building small communities and practicing Christian communion. These were people who based their lives on what they read in the Gospels and Acts. Grebel had been expelled from Zurich, but subsequently the city authorities went much further. In 1527, an Anabaptist called Felix Mantz was drowned in the river Limmat in a cruelly ironic execution. The Protestants had started killing their own heretics. The Anabaptists were the Reds under the bed of the Reformation, and they were treated brutally by both sides. The Anabaptist leader, Michael Sattler, was charged with denying transubstantiation, infant baptism, and last rites, and for despising the Blessed Virgin. He was also accused of saying that it was wrong to fight the Turks. He was horrifically executed, and his wife was drowned for good measure. Then there was Jakob Hutter, leader of an Anabaptist community in the Tyrol. This group practiced an early form of communism, banning private property and sharing everything in common, straight out of the pages of Acts. Hutter was caught in 1535, part drowned, then tortured and burnt at the stake. His followers, the Hutterites, moved from place to place across subsequent centuries, eventually moving to America in the 19th century, where they continued to be ostracized and abused. Today, happily, they are thriving, mainly in Canada. Similarly, the Dutch Anabaptist Menno Simons started a community that became the Mennonites. He planted congregations in the Netherlands and Germany and spent 25 years underground, secretly spreading the Anabaptist gospel. League of Protestant Gentlemen. Why, you might be asking, did any of the big players in Europe simply gang up on these newly Protestant states and force them back into the Catholic fold? Good question. Glad you're paying attention. Well, part of the reason was that Europe was seriously disunited. At one point, the troops of Charles V even occupied and pillaged Rome and took the Pope prisoner. Not much unity there. And then the Turks invaded Hungary, which took everyone's mind off the trouble in Germany. The Turks reached Vienna, but then had to retreat. Before they went, the Viennese had a look at the crescents on their flags and invented a new pastry. Yes, the Viennese whirl, or maybe the croissant, one of the two. Charles V did make diplomatic attempts to solve the crisis. In 1529, he called a diet of all the German rulers at Speyer, which decreed that Protestant states must return to the Catholic fold. But 6 princes and 14 cities refused and delivered an official letter of protest, a document known as the Protestation, and that, children, is why they became known as Protestants. Charles realized that he really needed to bring unity, and if that meant making compromises with the Protestants, then so be it. So he called another council, this time at Augsburg in 1530. It was attended by Luther's deputy, Philip Melanchthon, who was far more patient and far less potty-mouthed than his mentor. Melanchthon prepared a kind of Protestant statement of faith for the occasion, which became known as the Augsburg Confession. This was to become the central doctrinal document of Lutheranism. It went as far as they felt they could go towards Catholicism, choosing to skate over contentious issues such as purgatory. It concentrated on the positive, accentuating things like justification by faith and the importance of preaching. It worked, sort of. I mean, it didn't convert the Catholics, obviously, but it brought the Protestants far more support. And these Protestant states gathered together in the unwieldily named Schmalkaldig League, which was the strongest league in Europe, right up to the time of the Premiership. Zwingli didn't join them. He was in a strop, his own statement of faith having been effectively ignored by the Diet. He formed his own league, an alliance of Swiss reformed cities. Eventually there was a civil war between these cities and the ones that had remained Catholic. Zwingli died in battle, hacked to death by Swiss Catholic soldiers, armed presumably only with their standard issue pocket knives. His body was burnt and mixed with manure to stop his followers venerating his remains. He ended up literally in the brown stuff. Münster Inc. This is Münster, not Minster. 16 years before Luther probably didn't nail his theses to the door, a man called Jos Fritz went to church. He didn't go to worship, but to protest. He walked in and placed a banner over a picture of the crucified Christ. On the banner was the laced boot of a peasant and the phrase, "Nothing but the justice of God." Over the next 3 decades, there were repeated uprisings by the peasants against the landowners, calling for an end to oppression, an end to taxes, tolls and tithes, and free use of common land, rivers and woods, and generally a society based on the Bible and divine justice. The uprising Jos planned for 1502 was betrayed, and Jos had to flee for his life. He organised another one in 1513, But that was betrayed, and he had to flee for his life. He organised another one in 1517, but this was betrayed, and, well, you can guess the rest. Friedrich Engels called Fritz a model conspirator, by which he presumably meant completely hapless failure. From the start, these grievances were rooted in the Bible, but as time went on, they took on a much more reforming character. It was a Protestant pastor, Christoph Schappler, who, along with a tanner called Sebastian Lotzer, wrote the Peasants' Manifesto, the 12 Articles of the Peasants, in March 1525. This called for the reform of rents, taxes and servitude, but also for the reform of the church, including the removal of pictures and images, the preaching of the pure gospel, and the right to elect the parish priest, whom they would then support from tithes collected in a way of their own choosing, with any surplus going to the poor. Between Fritz's banner and Lotzer's pamphlet, of course, Luther had risen to prominence. The peasants looked to Luther for support, but although he had sympathy with some of their concerns, he hated the idea of rebellion. He argued that the Bible clearly supported slavery. After all, didn't the patriarchs of the Old Testament have slaves? Didn't Paul tell slaves to be obedient? In his dealings with the peasants, Luther was out of his depth. He wanted church reformation, not political revolt. But it felt like a terrible betrayal. And when the violence started to rise, when things started to get bloody, Luther went into a panic and abandoned them to their fate. In a typically polemical tract against the robbing and murdering hordes of peasants, he declared that anyone who killed a rebellious peasant was doing God's will. Over 100,000 peasants were slaughtered in 1525 alone. The end to this terrible recurring story of crushed revolts comes a decade later. In the German city of Münster, a former Lutheran pastor called Bernie Rothman started to preach that the second coming of Christ was imminent, and that Münster would be the New Jerusalem. The city soon became a nexus for all sorts of disenfranchised, extreme Anabaptist groups. Jan Matthys replaced Rothman as leader and urged a violent revolution. His fellow leader, the dangerously unbalanced Jan Bukkelzoon, aka Jan of Leyden, took things even further. He banned all books except the Bible. You want sola scriptura? You got it. The situation descended into diseased chaos. The forces of the Bishop of Münster and his troops blockaded the city. The food ran out. Anarchy. Jan of Leyden declared himself the new Messiah, the successor to King David, playing out the life of an Old Testament king, practicing polygamy, and living in luxury, while all around him the people starved, and their fevered dreams died. In the end, there could only be one outcome. In 1536, the city was captured. The New Jerusalem was brutally and sadistically crushed. The leaders were tortured and executed, and their bodies hung in cages from the tower of the city church. You can still see the cages there today.